Grab this, buddy. Amen. You guys can grab a seat. Well, good morning to all of you. It's so good to see you guys. I wish I could see your smiles, but not right now, not this morning. Until we go outside, I can't wait to talk with all of you. But hey, my name is Austin. I'm one of the pastors here. Like I said, super excited to be here. It's kind of funny. We just sent out Mo last week. We're kind of bummed, and then this week, Brett decides to not be here. Jeremy decides to not be here. Skylar decides to not be here. So I have a bone to pick with those guys. Next time you see them, just say, hey, can you guys maybe organize your vacations a little bit better than the follow-up week to Mo being gone, you be gone too. Anyways, can we celebrate Jason though? It was his first Sunday leading worship on his own. We love you, Jason. We love raising up new laborers, and it's so fun to see somebody leading worship for the first time, and then to see Jason a year from now or 2 years from now as we're excited to see what God has for him, and hopefully we plant a church and he gets to go, and we'll see what happens. But nonetheless, he's coming on staff as our worship resident and learning under Jeremy, and he's a gift. So thanks, Jason. And so anyways, we're continuing the Heart of God series. We started this is week 3, and we'll continue for a few more weeks. And I'm super excited because we're learning more about God's heart. And for so many of us, we spend so much time in this last section of our Bibles. And yet, I don't know if you guys know this, but God actually is really cool in this part too. And he has a lot to say about himself and his love for us. And so we're excited to help expose you more to the Old Testament. And I hope that you would not just go, oh, I got the Spark Notes on 1 Samuel this morning. I think I'm good. But that you'd actually read it for yourself because there's so much more to this. And so we're going to be in 1 Samuel. You can open up your Bibles there. If you don't have a Bible, we have free ones as you walk out. They're blue. I love seeing people in our church use those and have those. So 1 Samuel is where we're going to be. As we're getting there, here's my question for you. How many of you, just by show of hands, have had a tick on you before? Raise your hand if you've had a tick on you before. Okay, for those who aren't raising your hand, I'm with you. Like, I haven't. I feel pretty special about it. My wife has had plenty. It's like this. I was born in California, raised there for most of my life, and she's a Nebraska girl. Makes sense. Anyways, her parents have a cabin, and it's out on some land and stuff like that, and we love going out there, and we're out in the trees, and we come back, and I think it wasn't the first night, it was the second night, and Kristen wakes up in the middle of the night, and she's like going crazy. I'm like, what? And she's like, I felt something crawling on my arm, which is like the worst case scenario, right? And you're like, okay, and so like a good husband, I shine the light, and there's a tick in our bed, okay? And so like a good husband, I continue to shine the light. She grabbed the toilet paper and she disposed of the tick, okay? I'm not trying to touch that, okay? And so anyways, and then so we looked, and our dog Legend had 2 ticks, like pretty substantial ticks on his head, and then they had like little ticks. It was just like disgusting. I don't know if you guys feel like a need to just go, I'm just gonna give 10 seconds for you just to check and make sure y'all don't have any ticks. Yeah, check each other. Anyways, and so my little baby girl, the next morning, we check her, like Gracie, and she has a tick on her head. And I'm like a protective dad, and I'm so mad that I have let her have a tick on her head this whole time. And so you walk through the process of taking off. It's terrible. Let me just say this. Ticks are bad. They're the worst for 2 different reasons. Number 1, you often don't know they're on you, right? And number 2, they're really difficult to get off. So let me just explain that really quick. If there was ever a spiritual equivalent to ticks, it would be pride, right? So just like not knowing you have a tick on you, so many of us are unaware that we're so guilty of pride, right? It's just like we don't see it, we don't notice it's there. One theologian said that pride is the mother of all sin. Right? In other words, you can trace your struggle with anxiety or greed or lust back to the sin of pride. All of it, you can trace it back to that. And so at the core of our sin is a ruthless concern for ourselves over anyone and anything. That's why we sin, and that is pride. And I know for most of us, when I say pride, your automatic association to that is arrogance. Someone thinking too highly of themselves, which is right, that is pride, but it's only half right if you think that's the only way that pride expresses itself. Okay, if you're not guilty of arrogant pride, which is the one I fall into, if you're in the room and you're not guilty of that, I want to argue that you may be guilty of self-deprecating pride, right? And so this is like the most poignant example of a tick being on you that you don't know. It often goes unnoticed. And so maybe for you, you constantly put yourself down in your head. I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy. I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't have said that. These people don't want me here. And we look at those, and most of us will go, that's not pride. In some ways, we go, that's humility, that you're not arrogant. And yet, if pride is a ruthless concern for yourself, aren't you guilty of pride too? By constantly thinking about yourself, even if it is in a self-deprecating way and not a self-exalting way. Tim Keller writes, humility, this goal, the opposite of pride, it isn't thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less, right? So that's the goal, to stop thinking about ourselves all the time. Just like ticks, pride often goes unnoticed. The other reason ticks are the worst is that they're really hard to get off, right? And so you can't just like grab tweezers and pull it straight off, because what will happen is they're so attached that you'll take the body off and the head will stay in, okay? So what you have to do, I learned this, my wife taught me, you have to heat up tweezers super hot and you grab the tick, and actually the heat makes the tick release, and then you can pull it off. And voila, right? And you're tick-free. It's pretty amazing. So there's your education for the morning. You got more than you paid for. Anyways, in 1 Samuel, in this book, we're going to see over and over that God loves humility and he hates pride. God rewards humility and he punishes pride. He exalts the humble and he oppresses the proud. And so this morning, I want it to be an attack on our pride. I want us to see God's glory and his grace and his goodness to care for us and want us to be humble people. And it might feel this morning like God is taking hot tweezers to your pride to try and remove it. So I want to let you know it's probably not going to be super fun, but it will be freeing. Amen? So just to give simple definitions of what I mean by pride and what I mean by humility, pride simply understood is self-focus, and humility simply understood is self-forgetfulness. You with me? And my goal for the morning is to show us that self-forgetfulness, this idea of humility, self-forgetfulness, frees us from two things: entitlement and comparison. You with me? So that's where we are going. Okay, entitlement. 1 Samuel chapter 2. I am so sorry that I extensively taught on ticks, and now all of us are grossed out and checking each other. It's hey, but it worked. I hope it landed. You know, y'all are like, this ain't gonna be fun. I feel like hot tweezers on me right now. Anyways, 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 12. Now the sons of Eli were worthless men. Now imagine for a moment you make the Bible. You're like, hey mom, I made it in there. And the adjective used to describe you is worthless. You're like, leave me out. Anyways, they didn't know the Lord. He makes that clear. And the custom of the priests with the people was that when any man would offer sacrifice, the priest's servant would come. Now, the priest's servant in this scenario that they're talking about is Eli's son. Eli's the priest. His son's are the priest's servant. This would be the custom. And so this is what they were doing, he explains, in their worthlessness. He says, while the meat was boiling, with a 3-pronged fork in his hand, and would thrust it into the pan or the kettle or cauldron or pot, whatever they're cooking in, and all the fork brought up, the priest would keep for himself. This is what they did at Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there, right? And so in the Old Testament, just a couple books before, in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy, what would happen is God would bring all these animal sacrifices to sacrifice to God for different reasons, right? And you're going, that's a lot of good food wasted. Like, can you imagine just bringing like Big Macs to this, like to the church service, and like they're just gone? It's like, could we maybe just get a bite? You know, it's like, that's good food. And so what would happen is God actually set aside parts of the animals for the priests to keep for themselves to eat and be fed, right? But what would happen with Eli's worthless sons is that they wouldn't follow the mandate of what God gave them. They actually took this 3-pronged fork, they would take it in, and they would take the best for themselves. So the first thing we see in these verses, it doesn't probably make sense when you first read it, is that entitlement takes the best for yourself. Right? They would go in, I don't just want what God would give me. I want to make sure I want to control this, and I want to take the best for myself. And really, in a lot of the ways, that was what belonged to God. Number 2, you continue in verse 15 and 16. It says, moreover, before the fat was burned, the priest's servant would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, hey, give me meat. Give meat for the priest to roast, for he will not accept boiled meat from you, but only raw. So right here, this is a lie. That's not true. It's a manipulation of saying, hey, by the way, what would happen is they wouldn't want the meat to be boiled. They would want it raw to cook it themselves. So they would lie and say, oh yeah, my dad's not going to accept it that way. Give it to me raw. And listen, the guy pushes back. I love this. In verse 16, he says, if the man said to him, let them burn the fat first and then take as much as you wish, he would say, Eli's sons, no, you must give it now. And if not, I'll take it by force. Okay, so the second thing we see about entitlement is it leverages your position for personal gain. Okay, so they had this position of power that they could manage some of the sacrifice, and what they did was they automatically leveraged it, not for the benefit of others, but for the benefit of themselves. Hey, listen, I'm going to do what I want to do. I'm going to take the meat how I want to take it, and if you don't agree with that, I will take it by force and leverage my position. In verse 17, it says that their sin was very great in the sight of the Lord. And so if you're thinking about this idea of entitlement, that we see this pride expressing itself in this way, in both choosing the best for yourself and leveraging your position for personal gain, entitlement fundamentally believes that I've earned. Every sense of entitlement starts with that phrase, I've earned the right to reserve the best for me. Right? And this plays out if you're a boss of any kind of organization and you walk in somewhere, there's this natural thought that I deserve the end table or I deserve the first, dessert. There's this weird subtle thing like I've earned the right to reserve the best for me. I've earned the right to avoid any menial task. I've earned the right to declare certain jobs and things as below me. It's like we've climbed this ladder, and we look at other jobs and we're going, you know what I mean, other things we have to do and going, that's beneath me. I'm not going any lower than what I've climbed up this ladder on. Someone else can do that. An intern can do that. Someone below me can do that. I've earned the right to stay and sit on this pedestal. And let me just tell you this, in light of entitlement and earning, what's so wrong about it is that it's fundamentally opposed to the gospel that we believe, right? As Christians, you're in the room because we have not earned good things. We have earned hell because of our sin and because of our wretchedness and because of our rebellion from God. That's the fundamental first step in Christianity, that you have to understand that you are broken. You don't deserve good things. And the gospel is that Jesus gives you grace and gives you the best thing, namely his son, namely entrance into eternity forever with Jesus, all right? So when we operate out of this sense of I've earned, it's in direct opposition to the reality that you've earned hell. So you can't say, I've earned hell, I'm a Christian, and simultaneously, I've earned really good things, so keep me in that entitlement. You tracking with me? Does that make sense? It's in opposition. They don't go together. And just so to be clear, I struggle with entitlement on a major level. 6 years ago, my wife and I were I was fresh out of college, and I was working at Sandhills Publishing, and they'd offer me a full-time job, and it was more money than I'll ever probably make in my life on an annual basis, okay? And I ended up turning it down, felt like God was calling me to the nations for a period of time and then into ministry, so I turned that down. Now, another church in Lincoln offered me a position. It was a paid role. It was a director role. It'd be great. My wife and I were in South Africa living as missionaries going, that's going to be our plan. And then this little church plant in Omaha called City Light calls me. Hey, do you want to be our intern? What? Oh, yeah, an intern. Oh, I don't know. I mean, what's the compensation? Well, you've got to raise your support. Okay, how much is that? Well, it's about $1,500 a month, and we'll pitch in $500. Okay, so $24,000. That's different that's a lot less than the first one. It's a lot less than the second one. And I'm like, what? And I remember I just on the phone said, I'll pray about it, but my answer is probably no. You know what I mean? And I said officially no to them, and we were leaning towards the job in Lincoln. And then my wife and I had this 24-hour prayer night that we did with some other missionaries. And the thing that God had brought up to me was, dude, you said no to something I want you to do because you're entitled. The reason I said no wasn't because I didn't even open up my hands to the thought that God called me to Omaha. The reason I said no is because I thought I deserved more than an internship. I thought I deserved more than $24,000 a year. I thought I deserved more than, you know what I mean? And so I was like, no. And I avoided this job that really, honestly, in some ways felt beneath me. And then 2 years later, or a year later, become the director of worship over the church. And then a year later, we plant City Light. It's kind of a crazy story, right? So that's 6 years ago, my struggle in entitlement. Just a month ago, we're in the church, and we have like paper towels and toilet paper in there, but it's not like the standard little paper towel roll that you have like the little thing next to you. It's like big stacks, and you have to go somewhere else to get it. And I see that the toilet paper's out and the paper towel's out, and I look at it and I go, yeah, I'm not going to do that. Someone else can do that. And I walk out of the bathroom, and Brittany right here wants to choke me probably right now. She taught our whole staff how to do that, and I didn't even learn how to do it. And I'm like, I'm the lead guy. Like, Mo and I, that's like not something we're going to do is clean or is change out the toilet paper. Like, I felt so entitled in such a way that I would think, let's make at least an intern or a resident or a director, but not me. I'm not the guy to change out. You get what I'm saying? Are you with me on that? Can you think of a time where you've been entitled and go, that job is beneath me? I'm just not going to do that. Someone else can. I've earned the right to avoid that thing. I'm guilty of entitlement. I'm assuming you are too. That is what we see in Eli's sons. And then we see something very different in a guy named David. Now, let me give you some context. Flip over to chapter 16. So we were in chapter 2. Let's flip over to 16. Now, what's happened so far to fly over? In chapter 1, there's a woman named Hannah. Now, she's disappointed. She's sad because she can't have kids. She can't get pregnant. So she prays to God, God, would you give me a son? And if you do, I'll dedicate him to you for all his life. So God gives her a son named Samuel, and she gives him to Eli, the priest, who has the worthless sons. Okay, and he grows up and he becomes this amazing leader, this amazing man that loves God and loves his people and leads his people. As he's going and Samuel's leading, Israel, God's people, lose a pretty significant battle. And in an effort to kind of diagnose, hey, what's wrong with us? Why are we losing these battles? They go, you know what? It's probably because we don't have a king like the other nations. So we want a king. Samuel goes, that's a terrible idea. But God says, you know what, Samuel, give it to them. They're rejecting me as king. Give them a king. And it's not going to be a good king. And so they pick a guy named Saul, who's handsome and he's tall. He's a lot like Anthony. And so he picks Saul, and at first he's a great leader, a great king, and then he makes some terrible mistakes. And God goes, you're not going to be my king anymore. You weren't faithful to me. I'm going to pick a king for myself. And so he tells Samuel, I got a mission for you. I want you to go find my king. Okay, where do I go? Find a dude named Jesse. It's going to be one of his sons, and it's in a little town called Bethlehem. If you know the Bible story, Bethlehem's kind of an important place. So he goes and he finds Jesse, and he goes, hey, I want to anoint one of your sons. And so he walks through each of Jesse's sons. He goes, nope, 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 nope. And he runs out of sons, and he's like, that's weird that God said no to all of them. Do you have any other sons? And Jesse's like, oh, well, yeah, I guess we do. I mean, little Dave's out back, but he's the youngest, and he just hangs out with the sheep all day. Like, I don't think that's your guy. And so Samuel says, yeah, bring him in. And God goes, this is my king. This is the guy that I want to lead my people. And so he anoints David king. So that's chapter 16. And you see that he's this shepherd boy that gets anointed king. And then in verse 21, it says, and David came to Saul, who's currently the king, like physically the king, although David's the up-and-coming king. And he says he entered his service, and Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer, which is awesome, right? And it continues, and Saul sent to Jesse, saying, let David remain in my service, for he has found favor in my sight. So imagine getting a letter from, like, the governor. Hey, I want to, what? Your son's the right person for me. I want to hang out with him all the time. It's kind of like really flattering. In verse 23, and whenever the harmful spirit from God was upon Saul, David took the lyre and he played it with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the harmful spirit departed from him. So shepherd boy becomes anointed king, becomes the armor bearer of the king, and then the personal mariachi musician for him, okay? It's great. He's like, this is awesome. So he's rising in the ranks, okay? And then in chapter 17, you get this story about David and Goliath. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't. And it's pretty astounding because if you look over in verse 18, this is one of my favorite verses. It says, also, this is Jesse, David's dad, talking to him. He says, also, take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000, see if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them. Okay, hold on a second, Dad. Love you, appreciate you raising me up. Don't know if you remember when good old Sam anointed me as king. I'm kind of a big deal. And then you got the letter from Saul about me being like his guy. He needs me with him. Oh, and I'm also the armor bearer, and I've kind of been raising up in the ranks. And you just asked me to deliver some cheese. Dad, I don't know how to say this, but I'm not really the cheese guy anymore. I've kind of risen from that. You know what I mean? Like, wouldn't you think that? If you were anointed and chosen by God as king, you were the armor bearer to the right-hand guy to the king. I mean, it's like, what in the world, Dad? I can't bring cheese to them. And yet David doesn't he doesn't say any of that. He doesn't argue. He just brings the cheese to his brothers. It's an amazing story. While he's bringing the cheese, while he's hanging out with his brothers, you find out about this giant named Goliath. And he's this 9-foot tall, unbeatable warrior. Nobody can beat him. And he's standing, defying against God and all of Israel, and no one's willing to fight him. This king that they wanted, Saul is afraid, and he won't fight him, although he should have been the one. And so it's at a standstill. Israel looks like they're going to lose because no one can beat Goliath. And David goes, the cheese boy goes, I could probably fight him. And he almost gets like a laughable response, like, dude, you're a kid. Like, you can't fight. Nobody else in all of Israel is going to fight him, and you think you can? Yeah. And he just goes, man, God was with me. When I was keeping the sheep, and I killed some lions and some bears, and he defended me on that. I'm sure he'll do it in this. And so he goes up against Goliath. They're like, dude, it's your life. He goes up, and you see this mini picture of pride and humility, where Goliath goes, here's all my resume. Here's how good I am. And David says, I don't come to you with a spear. I don't come to you with a sword. I come to you in the name of the Lord. And he's going to bring victory. It's awesome. David slings a rock into his forehead. Goliath dies. David wins. So let me just explain something. David delivered cheese and then later that day killed the giant. Okay, like just a pretty amazing thing. So here's what I want. Here's kind of an application point. The tagline for this lack of entitlement is that for the truly humble person, there is no job too high and there is no job too low. There is no job too high and there is no job too low. For David, there was no pushback on the cheese delivering. Yeah, all right, I'll do whatever I need to do. There isn't a job too low for me. And at the same time, Goliath comes in. Yep, there is no job too high. I'll take that as well. Let me show you the significance here. If you want to be truly self-forgetful, want to be used by God in a significant way, you have to come to the honest conclusion that you will do whatever God calls you to do. And even if that means a low, what you deem as a menial task, it's worth it, and God is calling you to that. And so for the truly humble person, we just have to say, I will do whatever. I love in our church that we have doctors on the cleaning team that scrub toilets. I love that we have attorneys that are holding the door and greeting for people. Like people that our society would go, you have earned a right to sit in the back and just not do anything and maybe just write a check once a month. That they're going, no, I'm going to serve, and it's amazing to see this group of people go, no, I want to serve and I want to do something. And so for all of us, if we're prone to entitlement, there's this invitation to say there is no job too low. And on the same side, if you're going, man, that's a struggle, some of us in the room need to hear that there is no job too high for you either. So many of us are paralyzed to do what God actually calls us to do because you don't think you can do it. You know what I mean? Oh, there's no way I could lead a city group. I just, I don't know my Bible so well enough, and I haven't, this and this, and no way I could be a global missionary overseas. I mean, they take the super Christian. No, there is no job too high. David goes, because it's not about you. It's not about your skill or your resume or your giftedness or your talent or your charisma. It's about God. And God will use who he wants to do what he wants you to do. And so for the truly humble person, if he calls you to a high job and you feel like it's higher than who you are and what you can do it. And do it like crazy and watch him empower you. There is no job too low. There is no job too high. Oh, and by the way, the very person who died for us, the highest job you can think of, sacrificing himself for the whole world, also in John 13, sat down on his feet and washed dirty feet of his disciples. And if Jesus, the guy we're worshiping, our king, says, I'm the king of the universe, and yet I'll get down and I'll wash people's feet, are we seriously going to think that we're above that? When we're infinitely below Jesus, and yet we think that we're above washing feet, and yet he did it. It's like, let's live out of that. Friends, self-forgetfulness delivers cheese and defeats a giant in the same day. Let's live those kinds of lives. Amen? Pride produces entitlement from what we think we deserve, and yet humility produces eagerness to serve however is needed. That's entitlement. Okay, that's the first tweezer going in with the heat. Pulling it back. It doesn't feel like you guys are loving this sermon so far. Maybe it's because it's not good. I don't know. Maybe it's because it's convicting. Anyways, okay, chapter 18. Now let's look at the freedom of comparison. Verses 7 through 9. Okay, so from this point, just to get some context, David is this infamous legend who has killed Goliath. And then from there, he just becomes this amazing military commander. He's winning everything he can. It's amazing. And in verse 7, it says that the women sang to one another as they celebrated, Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s. Verse 8, and Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me, you see the pride, comparison, this self-focus, they've ascribed thousands, and what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day on. So I want to look at Saul first and then his son Jonathan second. Saul's response to David's success is this comparative reality, right? And the first thing you see come out in him is envy. And notice, this is very important, Saul gets praised. He still gets praise from people, just not as much as David. Here's the key thing I want to draw on with this. Pride in and of itself is extremely competitive. It is constantly comparing. And so C.S. Lewis has this brilliant quote in Mere Christianity, and he says, pride gets no pleasure in merely having something, only having more of it than the next person. I'm going to say it again. Pride gets no pleasure in merely having something, only having more of it than the next person. So in other words, people aren't prideful about being rich. They're prideful about being richer than other people, right? You're not prideful about having a green lawn. You're prideful about having a greener lawn than your neighbor. You're not prideful about having so-and-so square footage. You're excited about having more square footage than your family member, a better neighborhood, a bigger backyard, a higher paycheck, a corner office. But it's all in comparison, in a competition to have more. And listen, pride plays out in spiritual things as well. You're not just prideful that you've memorized verses, you're prideful that you've memorized more verses than someone else. And it often comes out when you see that you've memorized more than someone else. You're prideful that you lead a city group and someone doesn't, that you serve often and they barely do at all. It can play out. Listen, pride, self-focused pride is constantly comparing what you have and what you do to other people. And it's exhausting. It's the reason we're so tired. It's a rat race to have more, bigger, better, newer, nicer. Pride produces comparison that eventually results in envy. And then look over, so what happens is that David and Saul, who were once really close, Saul becomes, he's envious, he doesn't like it, he doesn't like David. He tries to kill David, and then in verse 29 in chapter 18, it says, Saul was even more afraid of David, and so Saul was David's enemy continually. Saul was David's enemy continually. Now, this is really key for you to understand. What unfortunately happens with envy over time is that it distances you from the people that you're comparing yourself to, which is namely the people closest in your life, your friends, your family, whatever it may be. Saul's pride lost him a loyal warrior. Saul's self-focus lost him a close friend and made David his enemy. What happens is that we're so concerned with keeping up or having more than the other person that we not only strive for more for us, but we eventually strive for less for them. And it plays out in a lot of different ways, but one of them is like, imagine your friend gets this dream house that you've been wanting, and yet you're still stuck in your starter home that for the last 5 or 10 years you thought you were going to get out 2 years later. And in some twisted way, because you're so envious that they have it and you don't, it's like, you know what, I hope their AC goes out. I hope they have a neighbor dog that barks all the time. You know what I mean? It's like, I hope their taxes go crazy this year. It's like we start to actually bring people lower in an effort to exalt ourselves, and they become an enemy in our lives. And it can play out spiritually. We see people that feel like they're connecting with Jesus so well, and we feel distant from him. And we go, you know what? It's probably just a sham. The only reason they're happy and joyful with Jesus is because he's given them a blessed life. But they have and we start to compare and demonize people, and it's just so twisted. And so Saul shows us that self-focus robs us of 2 things. Ready for it? Number 1, enjoying what God's given us. Comparison and pride, self-focus, robs us of 2 things. And the first one is enjoying what God's given us. See, because we're so concerned with having more than the other person, we're unable to appreciate what God's already given us. Right? I used to love my backyard until I went to my buddy's 4-acre lot, and now I think my backyard's a mud pit. You know what I mean? I used to love having 2 kids, but then my friends got pregnant with a 3rd. Now I'm not happy with 2 anymore, and I want 3. Like, self-focus makes us dissatisfied with what God's given us because we want more and more and more. That's what it robs us of first. The second thing is celebrating what God's given others. So it robs us of enjoying what God's given us, and it robs us of enjoying what God, or celebrating what God's given others. Because we're so concerned with having more than the other person, we're unable to actually celebrate the blessings in their lives. Right? And it happens all the time. A friend comes, guess what? What? I just got a promotion, and this is the benefit, and they're going to cover my insurance, and I actually get a 401k, and your immediate first thought is, my compensation isn't even. I should be paid more. It's like this weird disconnect. And so to get real, this happened to my wife and I 2 years ago. We've been trying to get pregnant for about 7 months, which, trust me, I know is not very long, but we just felt we felt discouraged and like, man, this is taking too long. And then to top that, the Altmans, Ben and Katie, they were pregnant. They've been pregnant for a few months. And then we sit down for dinner, and the Morgans, Nate and Becca, tell us, hey, we're pregnant. And my very first thought to Becca and Nate saying they're pregnant was, why not us? Do you see how twisted that is in our pride? Like, I just found out that I'm going to get a little nephew, Ezekiel, and yet I wasn't even focused on him. I was so worried about myself and comparing and going, why? So I wasn't even a friend in that moment. It was like an artificial smile, and my wife and I get home, and she's crying. It's this wicked thing for us of like, what is going on in our hearts? We can't actually be happy for our friends. This is how it plays out all the time. Self-focus is competitive and exhaustingly comparative. Self-focus robs us of enjoying what God's given us and celebrating what God's given others. And yet we see something very different in Jonathan. Now, Jonathan is Saul's son, and so look at chapter 18 still, look at verses 1 through 4. These are crazy verses, possibly my favorite passage in the whole book. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the son of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. And then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, even his sword and his bow and his belt. Okay, these are crazy verses, especially in contrast with the way Saul is interacting with David. Why is this such a great display of self-forgetfulness? Well, if you flip over to chapter 20, verse 31, this is his father's advice to him. This is Saul speaking to Jonathan. Chapter 20, verse 31, he says, listen, son, for as long as the son of Jesse, which is David, lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established. Therefore, send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die. Listen, David is a direct threat to Jonathan becoming king someday. Because David's rising in the ranks, right? He's been chosen by God. Jonathan has everything to lose from David succeeding and everything to gain from David dying. And yet he decides to love David. It's crazy. What a beautiful picture of self-forgetfulness. And how different is his posture than his dad's? There's no competition between Jonathan and David. He hasn't allowed it. Jonathan doesn't allow himself to compare. Verse 4, it says that he gives him his robe and his armor and sword and bow and belt. Jonathan would have had the highest quality of things. David probably wouldn't have. And so him giving this is like, here's the edge, man. You've got whatever you need. You've got the best of me. What a backwards picture from his dad. See, Jonathan didn't just refuse to be competitive. He chose to be helpful. He didn't just avoid tearing David down like his dad, but he actually leveraged all he had to build him up. How, you may ask? Self-forgetfulness, humility. It focuses on what's best for God's kingdom, not ours. In fact, humility believes and trusts that what's best for God's kingdom is actually best for us. Self-forgetfulness, this is so key, frees us to be thrilled with our silver medal and simultaneously celebrate the winner of gold. Like, that's what can happen. That's the freedom that you can experience. Pride makes you an envious enemy. Humility molds you into an encourager. You want to know if you're humble? Are you actually satisfied with what God's given you? When's the last time you've actually just appreciated, God, thanks for your grace in my life. I don't need any more. I just want to thank you for what you've given me and what you've done in my life. You want to know if you're humble? How do you respond to God's blessing in people's lives? Do you consistently turn it back to yourself and compare what you have in comparison to them? Right? All of us are guilty of this, and we need God's grace to heal us. And so we're looking at David's example of humility and Jonathan's, but I want to show you that there's a better, more humble king, and his name is Jesus. And in a perfect way, he refused entitlement and he rejected comparison. And so in chapter 2 of Philippians, verses 5 through 11, they're amazing. Jesus is the creator of the world. I mean, he literally created the eyes that are helping you see right now, and the sun that's bringing warmth, and the way all of this works. He created all of it. And yet in Philippians 2, it says that he didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped, so he lowered himself. So you get this picture of Jesus in heaven. If there was anyone that was worthy, like that should have been entitled, it would be Jesus, and yet he doesn't. He comes down from heaven to earth. If that weren't enough, he doesn't just come down as a 35-year-old prince on a horse. No, he comes as a helpless baby. If that weren't enough, it wasn't just a baby in a palace to a wealthy family. No, he came as a servant, Philippians 2 says, and he didn't just come to serve and live his life that way, but he actually died, and he didn't just die at 90 years old in his sleep. He died on a cross for us, right? Lower and lower and lower and lower and lower. Jesus had every right to be entitled, and yet he didn't. He rejected entitlement, and because of that, friends, we have the gospel. So listen to this. Jesus had to go as low as he could because that's where we were, at the very bottom. Can you imagine Bill Gates willingly living in the slums of India for his whole life? No way. And yet Jesus had to go to the lowest place because that's where we were. A friend of mine lovingly calls Jesus a bottom feeder, right? He didn't spend his time in palaces. He wandered around without a place to lay his head. He didn't spend his time with the best and the brightest and the easiest to hang out with. No, he spent his time with lepers and prostitutes and infamous sinners and rebels and the outcasts that we often want to avoid. The God of the universe willingly lowered himself as low as he could so that he could bring us back to his Father forever. That is humility. Jesus refused entitlement. And second, Jesus rejected comparison. In John 17, as you walk through the book, Jesus constantly mentions this idea of glorifying the Father. And in verse 4, he goes, Father, I have glorified you. It's kind of crazy. There's this Trinity that we understand God to be. He's one person, but he's expressed in three different persons, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. We'll talk about it another time a little more in depth. But nonetheless, there's this temptation to go, but Jesus, I know you're in this Trinity. Don't you want to be noticed a little bit more? Like, why are you spending so much time glorifying your Father? His whole life, he's pushing glory to his Father. I want you to know him. I want to bring you to him. There is no competition in the Trinity for glory. I just want to tell you that. There's no like, well, the Spirit got more today, and so I'm a little bummed. I'm going to need to step up tomorrow. That doesn't happen. And in fact, to go even further, in John 14, Jesus says to his disciples, you're going to do greater things than me. Hold on, you're God, we're broken sinners. You're saying that, what do you mean? No, I said that right. You're going to go do greater things on this earth than I have. Jesus is our humble king, both by his salvation and example in us. It's pretty amazing. So what do I want you to do with this, right? What do I want you to do after the hot tweezers have grabbed you and pulled the pride off of all of us? My application very simply is to stop thinking about yourself first. It's not wrong to think about yourself. You need to care about yourself, but stop thinking about yourself first. A friend told me the acronym he lives by is JOY. Jesus, others, and yourself. If you live in that priority level, I think you're going to be just fine. You're going to experience a lot of freedom and a lot of joy. So let me ask you this. Can you imagine what our church would look like if we actually got this? Can you imagine? Seriously? A church freed from entitlement. Show me a church somewhere that everyone is freed from entitlement. It would be beautiful. I mean, we're all just serving each other like crazy. No, we're competing to get lower and lower and do the spots and the jobs that nobody else wants to do. No one's sitting comfortably on a pedestal. We're all on the ground level serving each other like Jesus served us. There is no job too high and there is no job too low for anybody in our church. Imagine a church freed from comparison. Like we actually love each other. Like we're actually serving each other. We're actually celebrating how God's blessing each other. We're actually cheering each other on and building each other up and helping each other continue to succeed and walk closer to Jesus. Listen, not only would we benefit from that freedom, but the rest of the world would see it as well. And the outside world would see and go, what is up with you guys? And we could tell them Jesus. The world cannot ignore a self-forgetful church. So I want to end with this. The question is, how do we actually forget about ourselves, though? We just spent this whole sermon talking about why we should forget about ourselves, right? We're freed from entitlement and comparison, but how do we actually forget about ourselves? $1 million question, $1 million answer, knowing God remembers us. How do you forget about yourself? Know that God remembers you. Hebrews 13:5 says that God says, I won't leave you nor forsake you. You can stop thinking about yourself because the Father remembers you and he's thinking about you right now. He's got you. You can stop fighting for yourself. God fights for you. Exodus 14:14. You can stop looking out for yourself. God's eye is on you. Matthew 6:26. You can stop worrying about approval. God delights in you. Zephaniah 3:17. You can stop comparing gifts. God's given you good gifts. James 1:17. In fact, God's given you the best gift. John 3:16, his very own son. How do we start to forget about ourselves? We remember that God remembers us. Amen? Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for today. Thank you for this church and for this message, and thanks for convicting me, Father. I pray that I would set the lead example, God, that I would live out of this idea that there is no job too high, there is no job too low. And Father, I pray that you would do that in our church, that you would empower us to see how you rejected entitlement and that we would do it as well, Father. And so help us to not try and reserve the best for us. Help us live out of this gospel humility that you lived out, Jesus. Would we believe that there really is no job too high, there really is no job too low, and would we serve like crazy? God, free us from entitlement and free us to eagerness to serve in whatever way we can, Jesus. I pray that you'd make us a church that has been completely freed of comparison. Individuals that go, you know what, I'm going to enjoy what God's given me and I'm going to celebrate what God's given you. Would you free us of envy and free us of making people our enemies, God, and would we be encouragers in people's lives? Jesus, I just think the outside world would see that in a beautiful way. And so, Jesus, empower us. We can't do this on our own. We're prone to self-focus, and yet would you empower us to really believe your gospel, really believe that you remember us so that we can actually forget about ourselves. In your awesome name, amen.